Hello everyone, my name is Lowko and welcome to another StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void beta video. Today I'm going to be discussing the first patch notes for the game and I'm going to try and give you like an unbiased review, but please keep in mind that I am sort of like a Zerk player in heart. I've played about, I think about 150 to 200 games of Zerk right now, so I can mostly give you my perspective from the Zerk point of view, but I'm going to try and give you a reasonable opinion about the other matchups as well. So before we go over the patch notes and before we go over the changes that they are making, I wanted to give a quick review of the current situation and how I'm sort of like assessing the game at this very moment. So currently, I think we can widely assume that Protoss is the weakest race, and that may not be very much so because of the units that they have or that the other races have, but mostly because in its very basis, Protoss is the one race that is mostly focused on build orders. So for example, early Heart of the Swarm and Wings of Liberty, we would barely ever see people go like Nexus first or like a Fort Fast Expand or things like that, simply for the fact that they weren't really sure if they could pull that off. Now, with trial and error and with playing thousands and thousands of games, people started realizing that, hey, I can actually stop every single Zerk timing attack early on by simply putting down my forts and my gateways in this position, and I can then safely expand towards the Nexus, and there's literally nothing the Zerk player can do. Now, I'm telling all of this simply for the fact that people are trying to do the Protoss build orders right now in Heart of the Swarm, and they're trying to copy over those same build orders also to Legacy of the Void. And I think that has to do with the fact that obviously that's the most comfortable bit, but honestly it doesn't really work. So what we would see very early on into the beta of Legacy of the Void a couple weeks ago is that every single Protoss player would try and do like a Gateway Expand or a Fort Fast Expand, only to see that, well, Zerk players would make Ravages and sort of kill them. So I've already noticed that over time, people are starting to adjust to this a little bit, but it does still seem, in my opinion, that Protoss is very, very weak early on. So they're actually changing one thing right here that we'll go over in a second, but they're changing the Adept, which is one of the core gateway units that you can get early on in the game. So as far as Protoss go, I would definitely say that this is the weakest race right now. Now Zerk and Terran are both in sort of like a league of their own, where they both have some very cool changes to them. Mainly Zerk, I suppose, is probably the strongest race right now, with the Terran Cyclone being very, very powerful as well, and the tank drops as well. But I would say Zerk is currently the strongest race, with then Terran and then Protoss, mainly because, well, Protoss and Terran both do really need like a solid build to be able to play against Zerk or against each other. Now I've heard from Protoss players that they are absolutely unbeatable, or that that pretty much like Protoss versus Terran is absolutely unwinnable for them, for the simple fact that Cyclones are in the game. And I've sort of noticed this as a Zerk player as well. Cyclones are the new Terran unit that they can start pumping out, and while they are very expensive, once Terran gets like a reasonable amount of them, it seems practically unstoppable. Especially as a Zerk player, I don't really know exactly what to do. The one way that I have found to sort of beat them is by hitting a good Fungal, but Fungal sort of requires the Terran player to make a mistake. Now obviously, I'm trying to stay unbiased here, but I would definitely say that the Cyclone is in the stronger part of things. Other than that, Terran seems a little bit weak. Obviously, you can still play the Marine Marauder Medevac style, but other than that, you know, I've barely seen anyone do that, and the players that do that just sort of die to Lurkers or to like Ravagers from the Zerk. And I think the same will happen in Protoss versus Terran, where the Protoss player will just make some Disruptors and just sort of nuke down that army. Now, talking about Disruptors, this is the one unit that does seem very potent, especially right now versus Zerk and versus Terran, where you can do some very strong harassment and sort of like blow up the opponent's army, but also harassment with War Prisms and do some very cool micro with that. So I would say right now, Cyclones, or not so much Cyclones, Protoss is the weakest early game, and once they get to the middle part of the game and they can start throwing out Disruptors, and then also can start going for, you know, all these other units, they are fine, but early game they are very weak. Terran seems to be pretty reasonable all around right now, except when they get like a massive amount of Cyclones out, and Zerk just seems the strongest overall, and I'm sincerely hoping they're not gonna nerf us too much. So those are the, you know, the points of view that I have right now, and well, with that, let's jump into the patch notes so we can have a little bit more thought behind this than just reading the patch notes. So first off, the Protoss Adept. The health changed from 80-60 to 90-90. The upgrades changed, a health upgrade instead of providing a bounce damage. Upgrades now adds 50 shields to Adept. So this is pretty cool right here. Basically what they're saying is the Adept early game was indeed a little bit weak, and with the upgrade they didn't really get that much stronger. But right now they're actually changing it so that the Adept is still going to be used for early on. And on top of that, actually be more useful later on into the game as well. Now, there's one very important thing right here that can actually mess Zerk players up and Terran players as well, I suppose. And probably Protoss versus Protoss, true. Adept can cancel the Shade ability at any time, and when you cancel, the Shade disappears and you do not teleport. So what does this mean? Basically, what the Adept allows you to do is activate this ability that allows it to sort of like travel in a Shade form, and once that timer runs out, the Adept will teleport towards the Shade form. That means that, for example, in Zerk versus or Protoss versus Zerk, you can harass the natural, activate the Shade, send the Shade to the main base, and while that timer is going on, you will kill drones in the natural, and then once the timer ends, you can get towards the main base. Now, what I've noticed is that the Adepts just sort of die to pretty much everything. You know, like if a Zerk player is prepared for it and you have a couple Zerklings waiting, Adepts will do absolutely 0 damage, and later on into the game, they are not that useful. So I personally love this change. It will make them more tanky, and it will actually make them more useful later on into the game as well, and maybe make us even see some Adept gameplay later on in the mid game, besides just, you know, the early game harass. The damage points reduced from 0.4 to 0.167, making them a bunch more reliable. Then we have the Immortal. Now, currently, the Immortal in Legacy of the Void is weak. Especially versus Zerk, it seems to me that you can just sort of wait for the barrier ability, which is now sort of like a replacement for the hardened shield that they had in Heart of the Swarm and Wings. They just seem very weak. You just sort of never attack them until the barrier ability is gone, and then you target fire them down and they're sort of just disappeared. The Immortal Barrier ability now absorbs 200 damage up from 100. Now, I feel this sort of like helps versus bad players. I mean, if a Zerk player is gonna target fire down a Immortal that has the barrier ability activated, that's mostly like a problem from the Zerk player and not so much a strength from the Protoss player. So I'm still sort of on the brink as far as the Immortal ability goes, because I do feel it really doesn't reward good players. I mean, maybe technically speaking, you could see that your Immortal is being target fired down and then you activate the Immortal Barrier ability, but I don't know. I'm not the biggest fan of this. Then we have the Tempest Disintegration ability, increased to 550. Now, this is also, I'm not a big fan of the Disintegration ability. I've seen it like once or twice when I played with Ultralisk, and then still Ultralisk just sort of kill everything that's called Protoss. And I'm assuming in the other matchups it's not very reasonable as well, or not very good either. But basically what it does is like a long damage over time spell that sort of like kills pretty much everything. But it takes like a minute or so. Like, I don't know exactly how long it takes, but it takes a very long time. And, you know, with that, the actual massive damage that Tempest used to do is all of a sudden a lot weaker as well with the Legacy of the Void patch. So, I would say the Immortal change and the Tempest changes are really kind of lame. I'm not a big fan of this. I love the early game Adept play, though. Now, with that, I'm not sure if Protoss is really gonna be able to, you know, be a lot stronger than they are right now. I mean, I said they were the weakest race, and I'm still thinking they are. Even with this little change, they may survive the early game a little bit easier and get towards the middle part of the game in a safer point where they can actually go for Stargate units and maybe some Disruptor and the core Gateway army. But I'm still feeling that especially Zurich is gonna have the upper hand easily in Zerk versus Protoss. And in Terran versus Protoss, I would say the Adept is gonna be a little bit more useful, but I can totally imagine the new Marauder fire will just deal with that, especially when the upgrades early on finish off. Like, once you get +1 attack and whatnot, it will just be pretty easy for Terran as well. So I am probably still gonna consider Protoss the weakest race, but there's only one way to find out, is by actually playing it. Then we have the Cyclone. So once again, the Cyclone is a Terran unit that got added into the game. They are planning on adding another Terran unit as well. Apparently it's going to be like an air-based unit. We can go over that once it's announced. But the current lock-on range is 15. Okay, that's pretty crazy. I actually thought it was 16, but maybe I'm kind of crazy. But basically, I feel like this doesn't really address anything. The lock-on range is now a little bit lower, but you can now upgrade the range to be back at 15. And I think the main issue with the Cyclone is that once you get a lot of them and you combine them with Hellbats, they are pretty much impossible to kill. And I assume that the same thing is true as well versus Terran, where you just get Cyclones, which will deal with anything on the ground as well as anything in the air. I mean, for example, in you know, Terran versus Zerk, they deal with anything from like Roaches to Hydralisk to Mutalisk to Brute Lords to like, they deal with pretty much anything, unless they get fungal down, like I mentioned. So I feel like this doesn't really address the Cyclone all too much. It's a little bit less range early on, but I mean, the range is still 12. That is insanely, like, that's insane range right there. For example, I believe a Colossus right now is 8 range. So, I mean, the Cyclone range is still extremely long, so I feel like this is still not gonna be the biggest of deals, and I don't think it actually addresses the core issue of it. So I'm still assuming that the Cyclone is going to be very powerful, maybe a little bit weaker than it used to be before. Actually kind of depends on how expensive the ranged upgrade is, but I don't think this is too significant. Then we have the Zerk. Now, I can honestly tell you, like I said, in about the 200 games that I played with Zerk, I have made lurkers probably a handful of times. I did upload a video explaining why they're strong and how they can be very powerful, but I did very clearly point out in that video as well that they feel kind of useless, lurkers that is, they feel kind of useless without the extra ranged upgrade. Basically what happens with the ranged upgrade is that instead of them like being able to shoot in this little tiny circle, they can all of a sudden shoot in this big circle. And it's an expensive upgrade. You needed to be at Hive in the past to actually get that upgrade out. And it sort of like made the lurker feel absolutely pointless until you had that upgrade out. Now here we go. They start off with 9 range. The range upgrade has been removed and the attack is more responsive right after it finishes burrowing. This is massive. Like basically what this means is that the lurker is now, you know, all of a sudden a viable option in timing attacks. So let's say you were up against a Protoss player, for example. Right now, you sort of either had to go very quick lurker in order to deal with their aggression, but more often than not, you wanted to play Mutalisk to deal with the disruptors. This probably is going to allow you to do some really cool timing attacks with lurkers, and I am super excited for this. I mean, this may not seem like the biggest of changes, but this is actually massive. This is actually absolutely massive. It means that you can stay on the lair tag longer, and, you know, you can actually, like, play Roach, Hydra, Lurker, Ravager, Zerkling, Corruptor, you know, no, not so much Viper, but you can then later on transition towards a Hive. Whereas in the past, you would have to go at Hive before really starting Lurkers because they were kind of pointless. So this is a massive change. This is a massive change. I'm super excited for this, and I'm going to try and play as many Lurkers as I can because this is going to allow us to be a lot more powerful. As far as Zerk vs Terran goes, this will also be just a straight up buff, and they will likely have some more time right now as well in Zerk vs Zerk. Now, they did make another post right here, where they basically explained the reasoning behind it, so we can go over those really quickly as well. So the Adept, our goal for this unit remains unchanged. We want a unit that is good early game harassment, which can also serve as a core gateway unit in the middle and late game. The health change is because the Adept is much weaker than we expected out of the box, so exactly like I was saying. We want small numbers of Adepts to be viable in the early game depending on how the opponent opens up the game. We also hope that this change, Protoss can take expansions a bit quicker and keep up with the other 2 races in terms of economy. So that's exactly what I was trying to say as well right there. It should technically allow the Protoss player to be safer early on, and it will allow them to actually be, you know, transitioning towards the middle part of the game without that many issues. The change to the Adept upgrade is because the bounce attack wasn't getting the micro interactions we were looking for. Nope, I've not even seen it once. What we really want out of this upgrade is for Adepts to function well as a core part of the army. The current ability is too pointed towards low health units, but we wanted a more general combat buff. Therefore, we'd like to try out something more straightforward. The final change is to provide more decision making and power to the player using the Adept Shade ability without making it similar to Blink. The most common feedback we hear is that in this area is that players want to be able to control when to teleport happens, but we'd like to avoid that, as this would make the ability seem more like Blink. So I actually really like the reasoning behind this. Very glad they're not going to be overlapping it. So yeah, the Adept is just straight up buff. And it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Then we have the Immortal ability, like I mentioned. I do not like the Immortal ability one bit. Our goal for the Immortal is for it to be more committed in the in-combat situations depending on what the opponent is building. For example, if the Zerk player is going heavy Roach Ravager, Protoss can potentially opt to use multiple robotic facilities and use the Immortal unit as a core unit. We'd also like to encourage more Immortal drop play in combination with the War Prism. I feel like this is all true. But in Protoss versus Zerk, I don't think very many Zerk players are going Roach Ravager once they figure out that it really doesn't work. I mean, Roach Ravager is great early on, but later on you will really need to come up with something else. So I don't really think this is going to be too true. I feel like most Zerk players that play a lot of Legacy of the Void have already started transitioning to playing Mutalisk Bane into Ultra. And I feel like the Immortal ability just, it really doesn't work in my head. Alright, then we have the Cyclone change. So the lock-on has been changed to a little bit less range. This change is really aimed towards getting more early game Cyclone shot dodging micro. Before things like unit speed upgrades and blink come into play, the 15 range feel like it's just a snipe ability. We'd like to try it out to change in hopes of seeing more micro on both sides. Alright, fair enough. Like I said, I don't think it's going to be the massive change. So here we go, Lurkers. Lurkers start off with 9 range. The Lurker feels buried at this moment, especially in Zerk versus Roaches. We really love to see more Lurker play. Against other races, the steps needed to start using Lurkers also feel like too much. Yeah, so it's changing up to a Hive is too much. Hydralisk then has to be upgraded to a Lurker den, which also competes with the Hydralisk upgrades. Lurkers then need to be morphed and also researched. The upgrade before Lurkers are really useful. We'd like to try out a change in order to see what happens when Lurker timing is sped up. I think this is beautiful. Like I said, this is awesome. It's gonna be some great changes. It may be too powerful though, but there's only one way to find out, I suppose. Then we have the Tempest Disintegration ability, probably one of the most pointless abilities in the game. We're seeing a lot of cool things with many of the endgame units, but the Tempest just doesn't seem to have a clear role right now. Especially for just Terran, they can just repair through the damage. We really want to see how... Oh yeah, so I didn't actually mention this, but basically they also removed the ability to actually repair or heal up the unit while it's being disintegrated. So basically it's like bound to die. We really want to see how our initial direction with the new Tempest turns out, and this change help us further evaluate that. Once your units are tagged with disintegration, you really have to decide if you cut that loss and gain advantages elsewhere, engage in combat, or decide to go for the skirmish attacks during the 80 seconds you have. So, yeah, it's actually 80 seconds, so it's a very, very long ability. Once again, doesn't really seem like very much of a StarCraft ability to me. Same goes for the Immortal ability. I don't think they're that... I don't think they're that strong of ability. Everything else seems pretty cool. Cyclone range is still very long. Lurker range may be a little bit too powerful as well. And especially Protoss is going to be weak early game. Maybe a little bit of a change to the Adept. But I just... I don't know. It's going to be very interesting for me to see. I feel like this is not enough. I feel like this is not enough, but obviously what Blizzard doesn't want to do is like buff a certain race incredibly much and then tune it down. They'd rather go with like small incremental changes. So what may end up happening is that like, we will get like a better mothership core. Like the mothership core will start off with more energy or something like that. Or at least like, cannons will do more damage or something silly like that, just so Protoss is stronger in the game. I think they're just going to take small steps, and once they realize that's a good point, then they will actually stop using it. So what is next? In addition to reviewing your feedback after this update, we're also looking in these areas. Protoss' ability to take lay their bases in larger maps. We're considering having specific units that warp in faster. Maybe the Adept. Ooh, I like that. That's awesome. That is really cool, actually. I like that. Overall, we'd like to change the warp in being dependent on position, but maybe we could have specific units that are more resilient to getting picked off quickly. All right. Splitting mech upgrades. Internally, okay, so basically what happens right now is that the mechanical upgrades for all the Terran units are like sort of like bound together, where you have attack for air and attack for ground at the same upgrade, which they basically added at some point in Heart of the Swarm. Internally, we've been playing with splitting these upgrades again, and we believe that the commitment in upgrades makes much more of interesting pure mech games or bio-supported by mech games. Fair enough, I feel like everyone is playing mech right now, so this is cool. Our concern is that we don't yet know how strong or weak mech is currently. I feel like it's not so much to do with mech. I feel like mech is in an okay position, to be honest. But I feel like it's mostly to do with the Cyclone and other races not having much of an answer for that yet. Now I'm thinking about it, actually, maybe Lurkers can deal with that pretty well as well. Now that they're actually like a viable... mid-game unit. But then again, siege tanks are pretty... Alright, whatever. I'm thinking out loud here. So then we have the very last little bit right here. Transitioning late-game units. While we feel like we're doing well in this area, we'd like to evaluate all 3 races again to confirm. Examples of strong late-game transition units we're seeing right now are Carriers, Battlecruisers, Banshee with speed, Ultralisk, etc. We want to be as detailed as possible with sharing our thoughts so that you're on the loop and can contribute. Alright, so if any Blizzard employee is watching this, I think you're on the right track. But yeah, watch this video. You will likely figure out what I like and what I don't like about it. All in all, though, I'm very happy with the way this is all looking. I think things are going on the right track right now. With the fact that Protoss is a little bit weaker early on, and I'm not the biggest fan of like the disintegration and the barrier ability. But other than that, I feel like the game is turning out pretty awesome. The only thing I would really like to see right now is more players to play against, because when I play at the same time every day, I feel like I'm facing the 10 same opponents over and over again. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you haven't already, hit that like button below. Other than that, also make sure you hit that subscribe button below so you will be able to, stay in the loop of all the things that I upload. And obviously there's going to be a lot more patch notes happening as well, because Legacy of the Void is not even remotely done. I want to thank you guys all for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile. And I'll see you in the next one.